An obese peasant was sold to a duke as punishment by her father. But what happens next shocked everyone. The village square is muddy, crowded, and cruel. A trembling young woman is paraded like cattle, her father's jeers cutting deeper than any whip. Then, silence falls. A carriage door opens, the duke himself steps down, his shadow stretching long across the cobblestones. But instead of scorn, he shocks the crowd with a single command. She shall enter my household not as a beast, but with trust. Inside the stone fortress, whispers rise like snakes. Servants mock, nobles sneer. Yet the girl's hands bring bread from ashes, laughter to a lonely child, and an unexpected warmth into the duke's silent halls. But a darker truth lingers in the shadows. One letter, one secret from her disgraced mother, could ruin them all. Now the bells toll, scandal brews, and a choice must be made. Will shame drive her back into the mud, or will courage lift her higher than any crown? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The autumn morning dawned cold and gray over the village square, where muddy puddles reflected the dreary sky. Market day brought the usual bustle of traders and farmers setting up their wares, but today the air crackled with cruel excitement as Rosamond struggled with her heavy baskets of turnips. Her strong arms lifted each load with practiced ease, though her heart grew heavier with each step. Children darted around her feet, pointing and giggling at her large frame. "Look how big she is," one boy shouted. "Like a cart horse." Another joined in. "My pa says she eats more than his ox." Rosamond kept her eyes down, focusing on the squelch of her boots in the mud. The jeers were familiar companions, as constant as the morning dew. Her father's voice cut through the taunts like a whip. "Worthless girl," Gervais spat, his face red with rage. "Those turnips could feed 3 normal daughters instead of one like you." He stood by their market stall, his clothes stained with last night's ale, glaring at Rosamond as she carefully arranged the vegetables. The morning wore on, and the market square filled with more villagers. Rosamond noticed a fine carriage arriving, bearing the duke's crest, but she kept to her work. Her father, however, perked up like a fox spotting a hen when the duke's steward emerged, dressed in fine wool and carrying a leather purse. Gervais's eyes gleamed with sudden calculation. "Here now," he called out, loud enough to draw attention. "Who'll take this great lump off my hands? She's strong as any farmhand, though she eats twice as much." His voice carried across the square, drawing a crowd. Rosamond's cheeks burned with shame, but she stood frozen, unable to flee. The steward paused, eyeing Gervais with distaste, but Gervais, encouraged by the gathering audience, grew bolder. "Come now, good sir. The duke must need strong arms in his castle. I'll sell her cheap as any cow." The villagers laughed, forming a circle around them. Rosamond felt dozens of eyes upon her as Gervais grabbed her arm, forcing her to turn this way and that, like livestock at auction. "See, built to work, and obedient too, hasn't said a word against her dear father, has she?" The crowd's laughter died suddenly, replaced by hasty bows and curtsies. The duke's carriage had drawn closer, and Duke Leopold himself stepped down, his tall figure commanding immediate respect. His stern face surveyed the scene, taking in Gervais's cruel display and Rosamond's quiet dignity. "What transpires here?" the Duke asked, his voice quiet, but carrying authority that silenced even the most distant whispers. Gervais, too far committed to retreat, pushed forward with false hardiness. "Your Grace, I merely offer my daughter's service to your household. Strong as an ox, she is, and going cheap." The Duke's gaze fell on Rosamond, noting her downcast eyes and trembling hands, the careful way she held herself, despite her shame. Then he looked at Gervais, who wilted slightly under that steady regard. "Name your price," the Duke said finally, causing gasps among the onlookers. Gervais named a sum so low it brought fresh color to Rosamond's cheeks. The Duke's steward counted out the coins without haggling, letting each one clink deliberately into Gervais's eager palm. But, before Gervais could crow in triumph, the Duke spoke again, his voice carrying across the now silent square. "She shall enter my household, not as a beast, but as one entrusted with my kitchens." The pronouncement fell like summer rain on parched earth. Rosamond's head lifted slightly, her eyes wide with disbelief. The villagers murmured among themselves, scandal and speculation already brewing. The Duke's steward guided Rosamond to the waiting carriage, her few belongings quickly gathered in a small bundle. As she climbed inside, the rich leather seat felt foreign beneath her rough skirts. Through the window, she caught a final glimpse of her father counting his coins, of the villagers staring and whispering, of the only life she had known fading into the morning mist. The carriage wheels began to turn, sending muddy spray across the square. Rosamond sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. As the village and its cruel laughter receded behind them, the Duke had already mounted his horse, to ride alongside, his presence both terrifying and reassuring. As they made their way toward the castle that would become her new home, the carriage wheels turned steadily along the country road, each rotation carrying Rosamond further from everything she had ever known. The leather seat felt strange beneath her, too soft and yielding compared to the wooden benches of her father's cottage. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid to touch anything in this fine conveyance. Through the window, autumn-touched fields rolled past, dotted with sheep and the occasional farmhouse. The Duke rode alongside on his magnificent black stallion, his profile stern against the afternoon sky. When he did speak, directing his steward or acknowledging a passing tenant's bow, his voice carried a gentleness that surprised her. "You need not fear," he said once, drawing his horse closer to her window. "My household is well ordered, but not unkind." Rosamond could only nod, her throat too tight for words. As dusk approached, the carriage crested a hill, and she caught her breath. There, rising against the darkening sky, stood the Duke's castle. Gray stone walls climbed imposingly from the rocky outcrop, towers and battlements stark against purple clouds. Candlelight already gleamed from dozens of windows, and the great iron-bound gates stood open in welcome. The carriage clattered across the drawbridge and into the torchlit courtyard. Servants hurried to and fro, some pausing to stare at the new arrival. Rosamond heard their whispers clearly enough. Look at the size of her. What was His Grace thinking? An obese peasant girl in our kitchens. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she kept her head high as she descended from the carriage. A tall woman approached, her black dress severe, and her keys jangling importantly at her waist. This was Mistress Heloise, the castle housekeeper, whose sharp eyes seemed to catalogue every tear in Rosamond's dress, every mud stain on her shoes. "Follow me," Mistress Heloise commanded, turning without waiting for a response. She led Rosamond through stone corridors and down worn steps into the vast kitchen complex. Heat from multiple hearths wrapped around them, along with the smell of roasting meat and baking bread. "You'll start here," the housekeeper said, pointing to a table piled with vegetables. "Prepare these for the evening meal. Show me what you can do." Rosamond took up a knife with familiar certainty. This, at least, she knew well. Her sure movements, as she cleaned and chopped, drew approving nods from nearby kitchen maids. When she spotted herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, she ventured to suggest a pinch of rosemary would improve the stew they're preparing. The cook's assistant paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. "She's right," she admitted. glancing at Mistress Heloise. The housekeeper's expression remained stern, but she nodded shortly. "Continue, there's bread to be made as well." Rosamond's hands moved with practiced confidence through the bread dough, kneading it to exactly the right consistency. She had done this countless times in her father's kitchen, though never with such fine flour. The other servants began to watch with growing interest as she shaped the loaves with swift expertise. As she worked at the broad wooden table near the kitchen door, movement caught her eye. A small figure stood in the shadows of the doorway, a girl of perhaps 10 years, thin as a reed with fair hair and large dark eyes. She wore a fine blue dress, and Rosamond immediately guessed this must be Lady Clara, the Duke's daughter. The child said nothing, only watched intently as Rosamond shaped another loaf. There was something in that shy gaze that tugged at Rosamond's heart, a loneliness she recognized all too well. She offered a gentle smile, and for just a moment, Lady Clara's lips curved upward in return before she disappeared into the corridor. That night, in the narrow bed assigned to her in the servants' quarters, Rosamond knelt beside her thin pallet. The stone floor was hard against her knees, and wind rattled the wooden shutters with growing fury. She clasped her hands and bowed her head. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "grant me strength for whatever lies ahead. Help me serve with dignity, though I am not worthy. Watch over me in this strange new place." Her voice trembled slightly as she added, "And please, let me find some small measure of kindness here." Outside, the wind grew stronger, battering against the castle walls like nature itself testing their strength. Dawn crept over the castle walls, painting the stone corridors in pale golden light. The familiar clatter of pots and pans roused Rosamond from her sleep. She rose quickly, straightening her rough wool dress, and tying her apron with practiced movements. The kitchen already hummed with activity as she descended the narrow servants' staircase. "There you are." Mistress Heloise's voice cut through the morning bustle. "His Grace is hosting a hunting party today. We need everything perfect." She thrust a basket of vegetables into Rosamond's arms. "Start with these for the morning meal." The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. Spits turned over roaring fires, pastries emerged golden from the ovens, and servants darted to and fro with trays and platters. Rosamond worked steadily, her strong hands making quick work of the vegetables. When it came time to carry the heavy trays to the great hall, she stepped forward without hesitation. "I can manage these, Mistress Heloise," she offered, lifting 2 laden trays that other servants struggled to carry one at a time. The great hall buzzed with conversation as nobles gathered for their morning meal before the hunt. Rosamond kept her eyes downcast as she set out platters of fresh bread and cold meats, but she couldn't help hearing the whispers and titters from the assembled guests. "Good heavens, what is that creature?" A lady in green silk murmured behind her fan. A young lord laughed unkindly. "Perhaps His Grace plans to use her to flush out the game. She's certainly substantial enough to startle any deer from cover." Rosamond's cheeks burned, but she continued her work silently, as she had learned to do in the village. Suddenly, a familiar commanding voice cut through the malicious chatter. "Better honest strength than idle cruelty, Lord Pembroke." Duke Leopold's tone was quiet, but sharp as steel. "I find industry and capability far more worthy of note than idle gossip." The hall fell silent. Rosamond dared a quick glance up to see the Duke standing near the head table, his dark eyes stern as they swept over his now chastened guests. The whispers that followed held a different tone. Surprise and speculation about why the Duke would defend a mere servant so forcefully. After the hunting party departed, Rosamond threw herself into the task of cleaning the great hall. On her hands and knees, she scrubbed the ancient flagstones until they gleamed. As her brush reached a shadowy corner near the massive fireplace, something metallic clinked against the stone. Reaching into the corner, her fingers closed around a small oval of cool metal. She drew out a silver locket, tarnished but still beautiful, decorated with delicate engravings. In the center, she could just make out a name. Elizabeth. Oh! A soft gasp made her look up. Mary, one of the chambermaids, stood nearby with her broom. "You found Her Grace's locket." "Her Grace?" Rosamond asked quietly, still holding the precious object. Mary glanced around and lowered her voice. "The late Duchess Elizabeth, the Duke's wife. She died 5 years past." The chambermaid settled beside Rosamond, her voice softening with sympathy. She was a gentle soul, but very frail. Some of the court ladies were cruel about it, calling her weak and unworthy of her position. The Duke loved her dearly and couldn't bear their mockery. Rosamond looked down at the locket with new understanding. "Is that why he spoke up this morning?" Mary nodded. "He hates bullies, our Duke does. Sees too much of what his dear Elizabeth endured, I expect." She touched the locket gently. "We should take this to Mistress Heloise. It belongs with Lady Clara's keepsakes of her mother." That evening, after the hunting party had returned, and the evening meal was cleared away, Rosamond sat alone by the kitchen fire. The locket still rested in her apron pocket. She had been too busy to deliver it yet to Mistress Heloise. Now she held it in her work-roughened hands, turning it over thoughtfully. The firelight caught the delicate engravings, and she traced them with one finger, thinking of the gentle Duchess who had worn it, of the Duke who had loved her, and of his daughter who now grew up without a mother's touch. The crackle of the fire nearly masked the sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond the kitchen door, and Rosamond remained lost in thought, unaware that someone had paused in the shadows to watch her contemplative vigil. Morning mist draped the castle courtyard like a delicate veil, turning the ancient stones into ghostly shadows. Rosamond hefted 2 heavy baskets of carrots from the cellar, her strong arms barely straining under their weight. The vegetables would be needed for the evening's stew, and she had learned to start her tasks early, before the kitchen became too crowded with other servants. As she crossed the courtyard, a small figure emerged from the mist. Lady Clara stood near the well, clutching something to her chest. The child's eyes were red-rimmed, and her bottom lip trembled slightly. In her arms, she held a porcelain doll dressed in fine silk, its right arm hanging awkwardly. "Good morning, my lady," Rosamond said softly, setting down her baskets. She noticed how the girl's fingers tightened around the broken toy. "Mathilda's arm," Clara whispered, her voice catching. "I didn't mean to break her." Rosamond knelt down, bringing herself to the child's level. "May I see?" she asked gently. Clara hesitated, then extended the doll. The porcelain arm had come loose at the shoulder joint, but thankfully hadn't shattered. "I think we can mend this." Rosamond smiled. "Would you like to help me?" Clara's eyes widened with hope. "You can fix her. Come to the kitchen with me. We'll need some thread and a bit of wax." Rosamond picked up her baskets, and Clara followed close behind, like a duckling trailing its mother. In the warm kitchen, Rosamond settled Clara on a stool near the hearth. She found some strong linen thread and a stub of beeswax, then carefully began to work on the doll. As she wrapped the thread around the joint, securing the arm, she told Clara about the rag dolls she used to make as a child. "We couldn't afford porcelain dolls in the village," she explained. "So I would stuff old cloth with wool and stitch faces with colored thread. Sometimes I made them for the smaller children too." Clara watched, fascinated. "Did they break easily?" "No, they were quite sturdy." Rosamond tied off the thread and tested the arm's movement. "There now, Mathilda should be right as rain." Clara's face lit up as she cradled her mended doll. "Thank you," she exclaimed, then shyly added, "Could you tell me more stories about the village?" That moment marked the beginning of a quiet friendship. Over the next several days, Clara would seek out Rosamond during the quiet afternoon hours when the kitchen work slowed. Rosamond would tell her tales of village life while working, stories of harvest festivals, of clever foxes in the henhouse, of old wives' remedies for winter colds. She taught Clara simple cooking tasks, letting her help knead dough or shell peas. The Duke first noticed the change in his daughter during an evening meal. Clara's laugh, a sound rarely heard in the castle halls, rang out clear and bright. He watched, surprised, as she enthusiastically described to him how to make proper pie crust, her usual timidity forgotten in her excitement. That night, after the meals were served and the plates cleared away, the Duke approached Rosamond as she wiped down tables in the great hall. "I must thank you," he said quietly, causing her to start and curtsy quickly. "I have not heard my daughter laugh so freely since her mother passed." "My lord is too kind," Rosamond murmured, keeping her eyes lowered. "Lady Clara is a sweet child. It brings me joy to see her smile." The Duke nodded thoughtfully. "Continue, as you have been. Your presence seems to do her good." He turned to leave, then added, "And Rosamond, the bread has been especially fine since you arrived." Word of this exchange spread quickly through the servants' quarters. That evening, as Rosamond prepared the next day's dough, she overheard whispers from the scullery. Above herself, "That's what she is," hissed one voice, using the poor motherless child to curry favor. "Did you hear? His Grace praised her bread," another added bitterly, "as if we haven't been baking here for years before she came." Rosamond's hands never faltered in their kneading, though her heart grew heavy. She had known such jealousy in the village, and had learned to bear it silently. Instead of responding, she began to hum softly, an old lullaby her mother had sung when Rosamond was small. The kitchen grew quiet as evening settled over the castle. Candlelight flickered against the stone walls, casting warm shadows as Rosamond worked the dough with strong, sure movements. Her humming filled the peaceful space, a gentle melody that spoke of comfort and home. Unknown to her, the Duke paused in the doorway on his evening rounds. He stood in the shadows, watching as this woman, whom he had first seen being sold like cattle, transformed simple flour and water into something nurturing with her capable hands. Her quiet song touched something in his memory, evenings when Elizabeth would sing to their infant daughter. For a moment, his stern expression softened, and something warm stirred in his chest. Then, without a word, he melted back into the darkness of the corridor, leaving Rosamond to her work and her song. The bells of St. Martin's Chapel rang out across the misty morning air, their deep tones echoing through the castle walls. Rosamond had been awake long before the first toll, her hands already dusted with flour, as she directed the kitchen's preparations for the feast day. Outside, the rhythmic crunch of gravel announced the arrival of noble guests, their carriages forming a steady stream through the castle gates. "The ovens must be kept at just the right heat," Rosamond instructed two kitchen boys, her voice firm but kind. "Too hot, and the pastries will burn. Too cool, and they won't rise properly." She turned to check the spicing of the main course. 3 plump geese she had personally selected for roasting. As she reached for the herb mixture she had prepared, her hand found an empty bowl. Frowning, she searched the workspace, but her carefully measured seasonings had vanished. "Looking for something," sneered Agnes, one of the senior kitchen maids, as she passed by, with an armful of linens. "Such a shame when things go missing on important days." Rosamond's heart sank as she realized what had happened. But she refused to let despair take hold. Her mother had taught her that every problem had a solution if one thought carefully enough. Quickly, she gathered rosemary and thyme from the kitchen garden, adding wild sage she had noticed growing near the castle walls. Working swiftly, she created a new mixture, even better than the first. As she worked, more sabotage became apparent. The butter for the pastries had been left out to soften too long, and someone had accidentally spilled salt into the sweet berry preserves. But Rosamond met each challenge with quiet determination. She chilled the butter quickly using cool well water, and transformed the over-salted preserves into a savory sauce for the meat. The feast hall slowly filled with nobles in their finest attire, their jewels catching the light from hundreds of candles. Servants began carrying out the dishes Rosamond had prepared, and soon the room filled with the aroma of roasted meat, fresh bread, and spiced wine. "This goose," declared Lord Pembroke, a notorious critic of country cooking, "is remarkable." He turned to the Duke. "Where did you find such a talented cook?" The Duke rose from his seat, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. The hall fell silent as he gestured for Rosamond to step forward from where she stood, supervising the serving. "Come forward, Rosamond," he called, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. Rosamond approached slowly, her cheeks flushing. She was acutely aware of her plain dress and flour-dusted apron among the silk and velvet of the nobles. The Duke extended his hand to her, a gesture that sent shocked whispers rippling through the assembly. "My lords and ladies," he announced, "before you stands not just a cook, but the very heart of this household." Rosamond felt the room spin slightly as the Duke took her work, roughened hand in his. "Since her arrival," he continued, "she has brought not only skill to our kitchens but kindness to our halls. She has earned her place here, not through birth or title, but through the nobility of her character." The reaction was immediate and divided. Several nobles drew back in their seats, faces dark with disapproval. Lady Beatrice, known for her sharp tongue, openly scoffed, but from the lower tables, where the castle servants and common folk sat, a wave of cheering erupted. They had seen Rosamond's daily kindnesses, her quiet strength, her willingness to help anyone in need. Clara, seated at her father's right hand, beamed with joy and clapped enthusiastically. "3 cheers for Rosamond," she called out in her clear child's voice, and many took up the cry. The Duke held Rosamond's hand a moment longer, and she felt the gentle pressure of his fingers before he released her. His eyes met hers briefly, and in them she saw not the stern nobleman who had purchased her in the village square, but a man who recognized and valued true worth. Later that night, Rosamond sat at the small table in her modest chamber, her mind still whirling from the events of the feast. Her fingers clutched her apron, twisting the fabric, as though it could somehow anchor her racing thoughts. The Duke's words echoed in her memory. The heart of this household. She looked down at her hands, strong, capable hands that had kneaded bread, mended dolls, and created feasts fit for nobility. They trembled slightly now, as she smoothed her apron, still hardly daring to believe what had transpired. The warmth of the Duke's hand seemed to linger on her skin, and her heart fluttered at the memory of his gentle touch. Through her small window, she could hear the last carriages departing, wheels crunching on gravel, as the noble guests left the castle. The sound of their departure felt like the closing of one chapter, and the possible beginning of another, though what that might be, she scarcely dared to imagine. Frost etched delicate patterns on the castle windows as dawn broke over the horizon. The sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground echoed through the courtyard as a post rider, his cloak crusted with ice, galloped through the gates. His urgent arrival sent servants scurrying, and within moments, the Duke's steward emerged from his quarters, hastily adjusting his coat. Rosamond was in the kitchen, preparing the morning's bread when Clara burst in, her face flushed with excitement. "Rosamond, there's a rider." But before she could finish, another commotion arose from the direction of the castle gates. "Where is she? Where is my daughter?" A harsh, familiar voice carried through the morning air, sending a chill through Rosamond that had nothing to do with the winter frost. She knew that voice, had heard it raised in anger too many times to count. Gervais stood at the castle gates, his threadbare coat pulled tight against the cold, his face twisted into its familiar sneer. The guards looked uncertainly between him and the castle, awaiting instructions. Word reached the Duke quickly, and he descended to the courtyard, his bearing regal despite the early hour. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Gervais gave an exaggerated bow, mockery evident in every movement. "Your Grace," he said, his voice dripping with false deference, "I've come to collect what's mine. My daughter must return home with me today." By now, Rosamond had made her way to the courtyard. Hanging back in the shadows of an archway, her heart pounded as she watched the confrontation unfold. "The girl is employed in my household now," the Duke stated firmly. "There is nothing further to discuss." Gervais's laugh was ugly. "Oh, but there is, Your Grace, there is indeed." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a hiss that still carried in the frosty air. "Did she tell you about her mother, about the noble Lady Isolde, who fled her family in disgrace, who married a common farmer, rather than face her shame?" The Duke's face remained impassive, but Rosamond could see his shoulders stiffen. Whispers began to ripple through the gathered servants. "If word of this should spread," Gervais continued, his voice heavy with threat, "imagine the scandal. The great Duke Leopold, harboring the bastard daughter of a disgraced noblewoman. What would your peers say? How would it affect your position? Your daughter's future?" Rosamond could bear it no longer. She stepped forward into the pale morning light. "Father, please," she begged, though the word felt bitter in her mouth. The Duke turned to look at her, and for the first time since that night in the feast hall, their eyes truly met. She saw conflict there, and something else, a warmth that was rapidly being shuttered away. "Your Grace," Rosamond said softly, her voice trembling but determined, "you must not risk your position, your reputation, for my sake. I am not worth such a price." The Duke's face hardened, though something in his eyes seemed to crack. Perhaps you are right," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "For the safety of my house, it would be best if you departed." Gervais's triumphant smile was almost more than Rosamond could bear. She turned away, unable to watch as the Duke withdrew, his steps measured and heavy on the frozen ground. "Pack your things, girl," Gervais called after her. "We leave at noon." Rosamond moved through the morning in a daze, gathering her few possessions. The kitchen staff watched her, with a mixture of pity and relief, all except young Clara, who threw her arms around Rosamond's waist and refused to let go until she was gently pulled away by her nurse. As the sun climbed higher, Rosamond slipped away to the servants' chapel. The small space was empty, save for a few guttering candles before the ancient crucifix. She knelt on the cold stone floor, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. Tears fell freely now, splashing onto her clasped hands as she whispered her prayer. "Lord, give me strength to walk away." Her voice caught on the words, "Give me strength to leave all I have come to love." The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the chapel walls, as Rosamond wept alone, the weight of her departure pressing down like a physical thing upon her shoulders. Outside, the winter sun continued its slow climb across the sky, drawing ever closer to noon in the moment she would have to leave behind everything that had, for a brief, Beautiful time. Felt like home. The days following Gervaise's visit dragged like heavy chains across Rosamond's heart. Where once she had commanded respect in the kitchen, now she found herself relegated to the lowest tasks. Her fingers grew raw from endless scrubbing of blackened pots, while others who had once sought her guidance now passed by with barely concealed smirks. The great kitchen, once her domain of warmth and creativity, became a prison of whispers and sidelong glances. Every morning, she took her place at the washing trough, her back bent over the endless parade of greasy cookware. The very servants who had praised her roasted goose at the feast now spoke in hushed tones about her imminent departure. "I heard she'll be gone by week's end," one scullery maid whispered to another, loud enough for Rosamond to hear. "Good riddance," came the reply. Above her station, she was. Mealtimes brought their own particular torment. Though Rosamond still served at the high table, the Duke's eyes never met hers. Where once he had acknowledged her presence with a slight nod or even the ghost of a smile, now he seemed to look through her as though she were made of glass. His shoulders would stiffen whenever she approached to serve, and he would turn his head to speak with whoever sat beside him. The kitchen mistress, emboldened by this change in fortune, took particular pleasure in finding fault with Rosamond's work. "These pots aren't clean enough," she would declare, appending hours of labor. "Start again." Yet amid this sea of cruelty, one light refused to dim. Lady Clara, defying her nurse's watchful eye, would steal into the kitchen whenever she could. On this particular afternoon, she slipped through the servants' entrance, while Rosamond was alone, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn pot. "Rosamond," Clara cried, flinging herself forward to wrap her arms around Rosamond's waist, heedless of the soapy water that splashed onto her fine dress. "My lady," Rosamond whispered, quickly wiping her hands on her apron before returning the embrace. "You shouldn't be here. Is it true?" Clara's voice quavered, her face pressed against Rosamond's skirts. "Are you really leaving us?" Rosamond's heart clenched at the pain in the child's voice. Gently, she knelt down to Clara's level, taking the girl's small hands in her own. "I must," she said softly. "But listen to me carefully, my dear one. I will never, never forget you. But I don't want you to go." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Who will tell me stories about the village? Who will help me mend my dolls?" Rosamond drew the crying child close, her own eyes burning. "I will keep you in my heart always," she promised. "And whenever you see the kitchen fires burning, or smell fresh bread baking, think of me, and know that I am thinking of you too." They remained thus for a long moment, until the sound of approaching footsteps forced them apart. Clara quickly dried her eyes and slipped away, leaving Rosamond alone once more with her pots and her thoughts. As evening approached, Martha, one of the few maids who had shown her kindness, hurried into the kitchen. Her eyes darted about nervously before she approached Rosamond. "I have something for you," Martha whispered, pressing a small packet into Rosamond's hands. The paper was yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had long since dried and cracked. "I found it in the village, in Father Thomas's archives. It's from your mother." Rosamond's fingers trembled as they traced the seal. "My mother?" Martha nodded quickly. "I recognized her name, Lady Isolde. From what your father said, the priest had kept it all these years." With another nervous glance around, Martha hurried away, leaving Rosamond clutching the precious packet. The kitchen gradually emptied as night fell, servants retiring to their pallets one by one. Rosamond remained, moving through her evening tasks mechanically, the letter burning like a coal in her apron pocket. Only when the last pot was dried and stored did she allow herself to retreat to a quiet corner near the dying fire. Her hands shook as she drew out the packet. In the flickering light of a single candle, she could make out her mother's name, written in an elegant hand she had never known. The seal, though cracked, still bore the impression of a noble house's crest. Rosamond's heart pounded as she broke the seal, careful not to tear the aged paper. As she unfolded the letter, the candlelight caught the first words, written in a hand that flowed across the page like water. "My dearest daughter." She drew a deep breath, steadying herself against the rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Then, in the quiet of the empty kitchen, with only the crackling fire and guttering candle for company, Rosamond began to read. The midnight bell tolled softly in the distance, as Rosamond's trembling fingers held her mother's letter close to the guttering candle. The servants' quarters were silent, save for the gentle breathing of sleeping maids and the occasional crackle of dying embers in the hearth. Her heart thundered in her chest as she began to read the elegant script. "My dearest daughter," the letter began. "If you are reading these words, then I am no longer of this world, and it is time you knew the truth of your heritage. I was born Lady Isolde of House Blackthorn, daughter to the Earl of Westamere." Rosamond's breath caught in her throat. She had always known her mother had been different, genteel in her speech, graceful in her movements, but nobility? Her eyes eagerly devoured each word. "In my 20th year, my father arranged my marriage to Baron Redmayne, a man of cruel reputation, who had already buried 2 wives. When I discovered his hand in their deaths, I refused the match. My father, more concerned with political alliance than his daughter's life, threatened to have me dragged to the altar." The candlelight flickered across the aged parchment as Rosamond read on, her mother's voice seeming to whisper the words directly into her heart. "That night, I fled. I took nothing but my mother's ring and my own conscience. The price was steep. I was stripped of title, fortune, and family name, but I would rather live honestly as a peasant than die slowly, as a noble woman bound to evil." Tears splashed onto the page as Rosamond remembered her mother's quiet dignity, even in their humble cottage, how she had maintained her straight posture while kneading bread, had taught Rosamond to read in secret, had never bowed her head to Gervaise's cruelty. "I found refuge in the village, where I met your father. He was different then, or perhaps I was too desperate to see clearly. But you, my darling girl, you are my true legacy. Not titles or lands, but the courage to stand for what is right, no matter the cost." Rosamond's hands steadied as understanding dawned. What she had thought was shame, her mother's disgrace, her own lowly status, was in truth a badge of honor. Her mother had chosen integrity over privilege, truth over power. "Remember, dearest daughter, true nobility lies not in the accident of birth, but in the choices we make. Be brave, be true, be proud of who you are." With reverent care, Rosamond folded the precious letter. She would show this to the Duke. Let him see that her blood carried not scandal, but courage. Let him understand that her mother's choice was not a stain to be hidden, but a light to be celebrated. Tucking the letter close to her heart, she blew out the candle. Tomorrow would bring what it would, but she would face it standing tall, her mother's daughter in truth and spirit. As darkness settled around her, Rosamond closed her eyes, ready to greet the dawn with newfound courage. Morning sunlight streamed through the great hall's towering windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Duke Leopold sat in his carved oak chair, surrounded by agitated nobles whose whispers echoed against the ancient walls. Their faces showed clear disdain as they pressed their case. "Your Grace," Lord Pembroke insisted, his jowls quivering with indignation, "you cannot allow this common girl to remain. Think of your position, your reputation." The heavy doors creaked open. Rosamond entered, her simple dress a stark contrast to the noble's fine silks. Though her hands trembled, she held her head high, clutching her mother's letter. The assembled lords and ladies fell silent, some sneering at her boldness. "Your Grace," Rosamond spoke, her voice soft but clear, "I beg your indulgence to speak." The Duke nodded, his expression unreadable. "Proceed." Unfolding the precious parchment, Rosamond began to read her mother's words. Her voice grew stronger with each line, filling the great hall with the tale of Lady Isolde's courage, her refusal of a cruel marriage, her choice of conscience over comfort. Several nobles scoffed openly. "A convenient fiction," one muttered. But Father Thomas, the castle priest, stepped forward from his corner. "I recognize this seal," he declared, examining the letter closely. "It bears the authentic mark of House Blackthorn. I witnessed its placement myself, many years ago." The Duke rose slowly from his chair, his presence commanding immediate attention. "It is not birth that ennobles," he proclaimed, his voice ringing through the hall. "It is virtue. Lady Isolde chose honor over ease, truth over power." His gaze swept the assembly. "Her daughter shows the same courage." Turning to where Gervais lurked near the door, the Duke's voice turned to steel. "You, who would sell your own child, who would twist truth for coin, you are the true shame here. Leave my lands and never return." The hall fell silent as Gervais slunk away. Then the Duke turned to Rosamond, his stern features softening. "Your mother's courage lives in you. Before all these witnesses, I declare my intent to make you my wife." Overwhelmed by joy and gratitude, Rosamond's knees gave way. She sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The Duke stepped down from his dais, took her trembling hand in his, and raised her up before the astounded assembly. "Behold," he declared, "your future Duchess." The morning sun caught the tears on Rosamond's cheeks, turning them to diamonds as she stood beside the Duke, her hand held firmly in his, while the great hall echoed with the gasps and murmurs of the stunned nobility. The church bells rang joyfully across the rolling hills, their peals carrying for miles. Morning sunshine streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the packed pews. Villagers in their Sunday best sat beside richly dressed nobles, while servants filled the back rows. All eyes fixed on the chapel door. Lady Clara stepped through first, her pale blue dress rustling as she scattered rose petals along the stone aisle. Behind her came Rosamond, radiant in a simple cream-colored gown adorned with delicate lace. Her dark hair was crowned with white flowers, and her eyes shone with quiet joy. At the altar, Duke Leopold turned to watch his bride approach, his stern features softening into a rare smile. Near the chapel door, Gervais lurked briefly before slipping away into the shadows, unnoticed and unmourned by his daughter. The priest's voice echoed through the hushed chapel as he joined their hands. "What God has brought together, let no man put asunder," he proclaimed. The Duke's eye will rang clear and strong, matched by Rosamond's softer but equally firm response. At the wedding feast that followed, tables groaned under platters prepared by the kitchen staff. Rosamond made her way through the great hall to embrace each cook and servant who had become her true family. Even Mistress Heloise dabbed at her eyes, with her apron as Rosamond hugged her. The nobles who had once sneered now bowed deeply as she passed, acknowledging her new status with careful correctness. Lady Clara danced between tables, her earlier shyness forgotten, as she celebrated her new mother. As evening fell, torches flickered in the castle courtyard. The Duke led Rosamond away from the festivities for a quiet moment beneath the stars. Their footsteps echoed softly on the ancient stones as they walked arm in arm. "You have given me far more than a duchess," he murmured, his voice tender. You have brought warmth and life back to these cold halls. You have given Clara a mother's love. You have transformed this house into a true home." Rosamond gazed up at the starlit sky, tears of gratitude glinting in her eyes. From the village below, the church bells still rang faintly, their joyful sound carrying her whispered prayer heavenward. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing me home at last. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me." If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.